Okay. Are we live on Zoom? Great. All right, everybody, welcome to the first reading of the fall series of Segue. Thank you for those who made it out, for bearing with our, COVID protocols and all that, but I'm really glad to see you. We're doing a sort of hybrid kind of event where we'll be also live streaming every Saturday these readings. Tonight, we are lucky enough to be hosting Max Steele and Edmund White. My partner who I curate the series with, Venn Daniel, is unfortunately not able to make it tonight. So I'm going to be reading their intro for Max Steele, but Venn is watching us from home. And this is what they have to say to introduce everybody to Max Steele. Hi, everyone. I wish I could be here in person to welcome you all to the space, to introduce Max and to hear the work in person. I had a big surgery on my mouth a couple days ago and can't talk or get around well enough to be present or attempt communicating through a mask. I'll be tuning in from home and we'll be there in spirit. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Max and Edmund for the work you make and for sharing it with us tonight. Max Steele is a writer and artist in New York who makes literature and performance and performative literature. In all the pictures he posts of himself online, his skin is perfect and glowing, and I'm very jealous. In all the posts on his blog, there's a beautiful textured weaving of narration, thought, pop culture, and art that expresses a devotion to the communal element of experience. I interpret this communal devotion as being foundational to how Max's work articulates a queer politic, one that's anchored in shared histories, shared and safe spaces, community, and non-hierarchical interconnectedness. His poetry is vibrant, cosmopolitan, entertaining, and super gay. It has a roaring undercurrent of existential sarcasm that pokes, prods, and exposes and interrogates societal structures and socioeconomic burdens. His prose often brings personal narrative, socio-philosophical inquiry, cultural criticism, queer life, and the works of other artists together to illustrate a perception of life built by an architecture of correspondence between friends, history, and the ever-changing temperament of the tri-state area. Place, space, and people feel vital to the life of Max's work. He brings social tropes, everyday objects, animals, songs, sounds, histories, religious and generational euphemisms together and transforms them the way a glass of water refracts a beam of light into a prism of mundane excess from which one might see a compendium of observational data interrogating life under capitalism. His work feels like the love child of Penny Arcade, Joe Brainerd, and some campy philosopher with a martini in hand. I could keep reading and reading and reading, and I'm really grateful for the time I've had with his work so far. Max writes the zine Scorcher, Door Girls, and Epsilon, and wrote the blog and hosted the reading series Fag City from 2006 to 2017. He was a resident artist at Brooklyn Artists Exchange and performed at the New Museum, BAM, PPOW Gallery, La Mama, the Queer International Art Festival, and the Queens Museum of Art. Please join me in welcoming Max Steele to the stage.
Thank you, and thank you, Venn, for that very sweet and lovely introduction. Excuse me. I'm going to read two excerpts, one longer one and then a shorter one from a project I'm working on that I hope will be my first book called Campus. And the first piece is the title story called Campus. Being young is easy. All you have to do is show up. You don't even have to make any decisions yet. No one expects very much of you. I was walking down First Avenue on a Saturday night in early summer. It was 9:45 p.m. and Bill was texting me. Are you still coming? Almost there, I texted back. I bought a pack of cigarettes and one of those little bottles of energy drink at a bodega. They say they're full of vitamin B12, but I'm sure they're just caffeine and sugar. Still, Drinking a little shot of something orange tasting made me feel virtuous, like the nutrition would balance out the cigarettes and the booze I was about to consume. Halfway to the bar, I remembered that I hadn't eaten dinner. I'd just woken up from an evening nap and smoked a joint before leaving the house. I stopped into my favorite pizza place, the one on East 9th Street, for a slice of cheese pizza, not too hot. They always heat it up too much. It burns the roof of my mouth. It's not my favorite pizza place because it's the best. It's my favorite because it's no one else's favorite, and I like to think I have a special love for underdogs. Gobbling a slice of pizza before a night of drinking and dancing made me feel like I was an expert at taking care of myself. It felt almost as if it were my real life, like it was actually happening to me. Stomping downtown in my boots, I felt cooler and more sophisticated than the college kids screaming and running around the East Village. They were paying obscene amounts of their parents' money to live in Manhattan, whereas I had already finished school and was living in a cheap, dingy apartment in Brooklyn with 3 people I barely spoke to. I felt like an older sibling or a resident advisor in a dormitory. I was only slightly older than these kids, but felt much more mature, wiser, and cooler. Below Houston, the scene was different. Here was where the grown-ups came to drink. Down here, they didn't dress as cute. They weren't trying to express themselves. These were adults, older than me, spending their own money, just trying to fuck and find oblivion. The bar crawlers were much louder, unsteady on their feet, and vaguely dangerous. I psychically tucked in my energy. I felt like a freshman again, hoping no one would bother me. I was running late for work. Bill was getting antsy. I made my way to the bar, a place called Cookie Town. Upstairs, it was a record shop and cafe that sold vegan pastries. Downstairs, it was a bar with a small stage where punk bands played. Once a month, they had a queer party named Guitars, Boys, and Dancing, or GBD as it was written on the flyers. And I was one of the resident go-go boys. I started dancing right after I graduated. I had seen go-go dancers at nightclubs who all seemed to be having such a great time, I could only imagine how much fun it would be to actually get paid to party. Some go-go boys danced full-time and made their whole income from it. I wasn't cut out for that. Those full-time go-go boys were serious. They worked out and had muscles and six-packs and danced at real gay bars where they wore jock straps, flirted with the customers, and got lots of tips. They had to dance to all sorts of stupid music and do it every night, it seemed. I met some over the years, and they talked about taking pills and wearing cock rings to give themselves erections while they danced. It was a big production. I was much tamer. I still worked in offices full-time and performed my music, my performance art, and acted in plays. Go-go dancing was only ever part of my income, but a great way to meet people. I danced at GBD every month. It was my claim to fame. I felt superior. I wasn't a regular go-go boy. I was a punk go-go boy. I didn't wear a jockstrap. I wore little cotton shorts over my underpants. At GBD, we'd dance in between the bands and afterward for a crowd of punk rock fans not normally accustomed to go-gos. I felt like I could get away with my alternative looks. I wasn't a gym queen like you'd find dancing on a bar. I had love handles and a t-shirt tan. I wasn't sexy so much as enthusiastic. I was often very sweaty and I never got tips. Bill, one of the organizers and DJs, paid for my drinks and gave me anywhere from $50 to $100 a night, plus 2 guest list spots. This was an ideal gig. I could never understand why the other boys I danced with didn't also want to do it every month like me. Some of them came back, but most of them only did it once or twice. Many times they were trying to sleep with Bill, and after go-go dancing, they'd go home with him, but then they'd never come back. Bill was sweet, but not my type, and didn't seem at all interested in me as a sex object. I felt like I got the better deal. I got to show up, get free drinks, make some cash, and dance my little butt off every month. I also got to go backstage. That night when I arrived, the first act was still setting up. Bill was annoyed with me for getting there at 10 when he'd asked me to get there at 9:30. Sorry, I said, though it was obvious I wasn't. Did you get my names for the list? Bill said he'd already given it to the door girl upstairs. I ran to the girl working the door and said that I needed to change my guest list names. Hey, I said sweetly, can I please update my guest list? I want to replace Willie with Cody. Oh, what band are you in? She asked me. I'm not, I'm one of the go-go boys. She raised an eyebrow and scanned the sheet of paper Bill had given her. See, I said, pointing to her clipboard. There I am, on the bottom, go-go boys, Max. She rolled her eyes, crossed out William, and wrote Cody. Do you want to change the other name too, Linda? She asked. No, I want to keep Linda. She's coming. Thank you. I ran back downstairs, through the growing crowd, and made my way backstage. It was really more of a storage closet, with the water boiler for the building, where the band stored their equipment. The first act had already arrived, a local blues-inspired trio and they were talking quietly to themselves. I saw Shiloh, the other go-go boy for the night, who was preening in the mirror and ignoring the musicians. We'd danced together a few times. Like many a go-go before him, he had also slept with Bill, but Shiloh stuck around afterward, though he never seemed to be having much fun. I actually liked him a lot, but he was leery of me, as if my chubby love handles or earnestness was contagious. I had a blast dancing to the records Bill played, but Shiloh seemed somewhat out of place. He was definitely not a punk. I would put on a single line of black eyeliner, but he wore fake eyelashes and glitter lip gloss. He was very sexy, and the crowd generally loved him. We air kissed backstage. He was already in his outfit, tiny pink underpants and big boots. He asked if Bill had given me drink tickets yet, and before I could answer no, Bill appeared and handed us each 4 little red admission tickets, like for a carnival. I guarded these with my life. Bill said the first band would probably go on in half an hour. I was miffed that he'd given me such a hard time for showing up late, but the bands wouldn't even start until 11. Bill turned to Shiloh and I. Hey, Max, get changed, okay? It would be great if you boys could dance until the first act, just to get the crowd worked up. Shiloh nodded silently, and I gave a fake chipper-sounding, sure thing, Bill. I hated when we had to dance before the bands. The crowd was sober, and the expectations were higher if we were the first live bodies on stage. I much preferred to go on in between bands as a sort of surprise, a bonus. I thought go-go dancing was decoration. Shiloh saw me rolling my eyes and asked if I wanted him to get us drinks while I got changed. I gave him one of my tickets and a $1 bill and told him to get me a gin and tonic, please. I knew Shiloh from the theater world. He used to go out with a sort of renowned older guy who directed plays, and I heard Shiloh went to acting classes at a studio. He sometimes posted videos of himself doing dramatic monologues into the camera, which I thought was mortifying. But then every once in a while, he'd get a small part on a cable TV show, cast as a gay neighbor or cashier or waiter. He never posted about GBD. I figured he was embarrassed, but I made it a cornerstone of my identity online. Shiloh came back holding 3 cups, 2 for him and 1 for me. It's Mary working tonight, he said. She's so sweet. Mary almost always worked our party. She was fairly nice to me, but she was really nice to the other go-go boys. I told myself it's because I was more authentically punk, but I think it's because she just liked the boys with more conventionally beautiful bodies than mine. I furiously sucked the straw in the cup Shiloh handed me and realized after a few gulps that it was vodka, not gin. Oh shit, he said, realizing he was sipping my drink as well. Sorry, let's switch. He handed me my drink, crusted with glitter. We toasted and gulped them before reluctantly going out onto the stage. My drink tasted like dishwater. Hey, break a leg, boys, one of the guys in the opening band said sarcastically. I turned and replied, yeah, thanks, over my shoulder. You too, dude. It was packed for some reason. You could never tell who would draw a crowd, but I guess one of the other bands playing later had a lot of fans. Bill knew a lot of musicians. He was able to get fairly renowned bands to come play his party. Usually it was people who had hit it big in the 90s, but now were down and out, playing in their new bands. Bill would coax them into playing his gay punk dance party at the vegan bakery. Often the bands who played GBD were made up of women who had been in riot girl bands I idolized in high school. I wanted to gush to them backstage about how much their work meant to me as a teenager, but they didn't want to talk about it. Maybe it made them feel old, or they didn't want to talk about records they'd made so long ago. That night, the crowd was big, so either one of the bands playing later were really beloved, or there wasn't anything else going on that would interest the tiny community of gay people who like punk rock. Shiloh and I got on stage and danced in front of the amplifiers while Bill played songs from the ancient 1980s. We'd get a few timid woos when we first appeared, but otherwise the crowd ignored us. No one came to see Go-Go Boys. After the first band took the stage, it was my turn to get drinks. At the bar, I ran into Lenny, who gave me a smirk and an affected, cool greeting. Oh, hi, Max. You're dancing tonight. He was being coy. Lenny knew full well that I danced every month, and he would show up every month, no matter the band. He was one of the few guys I also saw at regular gay bars, too, and was committed to keeping up his punk appearance. He wore a ratty crass tank top and a leather jacket, even though it was sweltering. He had home-dyed hair, half bleached and half black. Lenny was a few years younger than me, and we'd hooked up several months ago, a fizzling disappointment. We got drunk and jerked off together, but we stayed in touch. He was into text messaging and having endless chats online about how slutty I was, passive-aggressively teasing me about how I probably put out for all the other guys except for him, which really wasn't true. I wanted to be friends with Lenny, but always got the sense that he resented me. I thought it was because I hadn't let him fuck me, or maybe he was jealous of me because I felt no compunction about go-go dancing, even without a perfect body. I felt vaguely anti-patriarchal, if not downright feminist, by ignoring his aggression. Yep, I'm dancing tonight. Sorry, Lenny, were you hoping for someone else? Shiloh's here too. Oh, Lenny said, feigning surprise. He's hot. Yeah, well, good luck with that, I said. Lenny was about half a foot shorter than Shiloh and way snobbier in his taste in music. It would never happen, and we both knew it. I'd offer to buy you a drink, but Lenny, trying to be chivalrous, had to yell over the music. Well, I cut him off. I'm working tonight, so I get to drink for free. I waved a pair of drink tickets and a pair of single-dollar bills. See you later, I said brightly. I was being a brat. Lenny went back to his corner in front of the stage and watched the next band. My friend Cody arrived along with his roommate Willie, who I'd known since college. I introduced Willie to Cody years ago, and they moved into the apartment underneath mine, so we were all neighbors. There'd been a little confusion at the door as to who was on the guest list. I'd promised them both they would be. I pretended not to know anything about it. Where's Linda? I asked, another friend of ours. She didn't come, Willie said, putting two and two together and getting pissed. Linda always flakes. Did you put her on the list instead of me? No, I said, feeling no guilt about lying. I wanted Cody to feel special. He was my friend first, and now that he lived with Willie, I was jealous of their closeness. I gave them each a drink ticket to smooth things over. Like every other night I go-go danced, each drink made me feel both more comfortable dancing and only a little wobblier. Thankfully, Shiloh seemed to be drinking on an empty stomach and was having a hard time standing up. He was leaning against one of the walls, shimmying his hips and trying to look sexy. Compared to him, I seemed really put together, even if I wasn't as muscular. The headlining band was a local gay hardcore act I'd seen several times before. I wasn't interested in them, so I went out front to smoke. On my way out, Lenny asked if I was leaving. I motioned cigarette with the two-finger peace gesture at my mouth, and he nodded and followed me. Climbing the stairs to street level, I teased him. Oh, aren't you gonna watch the bands, Lenny? I hoped I was being catty and charming, but realized I was slurring a little. It was good to have someone come out to the street with me, actually. I was just wearing my little cotton shorts, my boots, and smeared eye makeup, and when we got to the sidewalk outside the club, it was still wild. Packs of now very drunk people were roving around outside the bars. Cody and Willie were outside smoking with a handful of black-clad punks from the party. They were all pressed against the doors of the club, but I sauntered across the narrow sidewalk and leaned against a streetlight to light a smoke. Got an extra, Lenny said. I rolled my eyes and handed him the pack. You know, you don't have to be such a little bitch all the time, Max. I wanted to reply that calling me a bitch wasn't really insulting, since I don't think being a bitch is a bad thing. But my tongue wasn't moving fast enough. Lenny continued, I know you really like me. Don't act like you didn't suck my dick before. He was saying it loud enough for my friends to hear. I wanted to counter and say that actually I hadn't sucked his dick, but then I remembered that I had, but only for a minute. Lenny almost certainly recalled our liaison with more clarity than I did, which to me was proof of his ultimate submission. He liked me more than I liked him. It meant more to him than it ever would to me. He still wanted me, and I never really wanted him. A group of loud women sauntered by, drinking out of giant plastic penis-shaped water bottles with straws coming out of the dick holes. One of them was wearing a wedding veil. This neighborhood got a lot of bachelorette parties. One pointed to me. Oh my God, Sherry, look, it's like a hustler. They turned to me and shrieked. I gave them a blank stare. Suddenly they shoved the bride-to-be next to me and one of them whipped out a phone. Can we get a photo? I stepped back. No. If you want a photo, it'll cost $1. This too was said loudly enough for the punk rockers from the club to hear me, standing in the shadows across the sidewalk. The bachelorette party was shocked. Whatever, one of them tried to drag the bride away in disgust. This time I was quick enough to respond because I had found myself in this position before. I can sell my body if I wanna, I said, quoting the Bikini Kill song. I burst into singing and continued. God knows you already sold your mind. The reference was totally lost on the bachelorette party, but Cody got it, and Willie shook his head and smiled. Even Lenny had to smirk at my quick wit. Are you fucking serious? One of the bridesmaids yelped. They stumbled in their high heels and started to walk away, muttering, Cookie Town. After a few steps, one of the women turned and ran back over to me, handing me $1. Here, okay? It's my girlfriend's bachelorette party. Fair is fair. She motioned to her friends to come back and they took a photo with me standing in the center, smiling like a shithead while the bride-to-be raised her leg and pretended to hump me. I went back inside and caught the last song of the headlining band. The crowd had thinned out considerably. I found Shiloh backstage sitting on a guitar case, taking off his eyelashes and looking miserable. "What's up?" I asked. "I'm just too drunk," he said. Too drunk. "You want the rest of my drink tickets?" He handed me his last 2 red tickets. "I called my ex," he said, "and I gotta go over there. He's so pissed at me." I didn't really want to hear about it. I thanked him for the drink tickets and got 2 more gin and tonics, slamming the first one and discreetly hiding the second by the side of the stage for the end of the night. Every month, I was surprised by how much I could drink while I was go-go dancing. After the show, Bill wanted us to keep dancing until last call. Last call is a magical time in a gay bar. You can watch 2 strangers approach each other across a room and either start making out or start fighting. That night, the bar was mostly empty, and the few stragglers were huddled together in groups of 2 or 3, including Lenny, who was talking very loudly with the few buddies he'd run into. Shiloh and I got back on stage. I took my spot, dancing to the old goth records Bill liked to play at the end of the night. Shiloh made a valiant effort to stay upright, but soon doubled over and got down on one knee, crying softly. I asked if he was okay. "I'm okay, I just gotta go," he said. I helped him backstage and he got changed into his street clothes. I kept dancing because I felt a lot of pressure to end things on a good note. Shiloh hugged Bill on his way out and was handed his little wad of cash. I knew I didn't have to keep this up for much longer. I found the cocktail I had hidden for myself and relished it, enjoying how thoughtful and smart I was to hide a drink for myself on stage. Again, it tasted watery. I danced slowly, dripping with sweat, shifting my weight from one leg to the other. Lenny stumbled towards the stage, yelling over the music, but was unintelligible. He started gesturing wildly to me, but one of his friends pulled him back and made him sit down. Bill gave me a thumbs up from the sound booth, so I went backstage and put my clothes on. I got my cash from him, and on the way out, made Cody and Willie take a car back to Brooklyn with me. Willie was still sulking about having had to pay the cover, even though it was only $7, and even though I gave him a drink ticket. In the cab home, I bragged about being able to hold my liquor so well, especially compared to Shiloh. Willie hissed at me that I was probably just drinking watered-down cocktails since I only ever tipped Mary, the bartender, $1 per drink. The other boys tipped her more when they used their drink tickets, so they got real drinks, which is true. If you drink with a drink ticket, you should tip more than $1. The next day, I got a message from Lenny. "Hey," he said. "Hey, Lenny, did you have fun at GBD?" I asked. "No." "Why not? Were you sad that Shiloh left without you?" I punched my friend in the face. "Wow," I said, "really?" This was a little surprising, but Lenny was small and angry and drank a lot of full-price drinks. "I thought it was you," he said. "I wish I had punched you instead." "Well," I responded, "you didn't." Thanks. Excuse me. I'm going to read one more. It's a little bit shorter. And it's called Easter. I wore the most expensive thing I own, the leather jacket with diagonal gray and blue stripes all over it. I spent my Christmas bonus on it, a whole month's rent, and then for years I never wore it because I was scared of ruining it. But I wanted to be impressive, and it was finally cool enough, so I took a chance and wore it to Mike's birthday brunch. I'd never been to the restaurant before, a bougie cafe downtown. I had gone to a rock show the previous night. That band, Royal Trucks, reunited and put on a shitty show. In the 90s, they were a notorious junkie couple who failed upward into major label success. They blew huge amounts of Virgin Records money on dope and never really made a beautiful thing. I was disappointed in their set and mad at myself for expecting more, so I got very drunk at the show. I thought Mike's brunch would be relaxed and casual, but that morning, miserable with a hangover, I thought how cruel it was that the birthday party was so early, 2 p.m. on a Saturday. When I arrived, they were playing very loud gospel and disco, not at all relaxing. A big table with 3 chipper, loud gay guys I had never met before, and 3 I already knew. Balloons and party hats for the group. The 3 guys I knew all admired my expensive leather jacket. They were appropriately impressed. The 3 I didn't know thought I was overdressed, I guess, but I forgot their names and they're not really in the rest of the story. I sat next to Jordan, who I had met at another mutual friend's birthday over the summer and had just fucked a few weeks ago. On our first date, Jordan wondered if I had only asked him out because I was trying to get a book deal. I said no, I didn't know what he did for a living, I just thought he was cute. He was miffed that I didn't know how important of an editor he was. At the birthday, he greeted me sort of coldly, weirdly stilted, but did admit that my jacket was nice. How could he not? I didn't understand why he was being snitty. He was the one who had rejected me after our second date. I went home with him and followed him up several flights of stairs to his apartment, and then he equivocated about whether he wanted to have sex. He still wasn't convinced I really liked him, like I hadn't been demonstrative enough. I tried to convince him and asked if I could kiss him, if I could stay over, but he said no and asked me to leave. He lived above the gay bar I went to all the time, so I just went downstairs. I tried to get together with him again after that, but he brushed me off. If anything, I should have been cold to him, but the day wasn't about him. Mike knew that we had gone out and sat us next to each other at his birthday party. He'd arranged the seats for the table. Jordan and Mike both told me how funny it was when once Jordan fucked Mike, or tried to. Jordan came immediately. I had heard this story from both of them separately, and they repeated it at brunch that afternoon as I was sitting between them. Feeling disgusting from the night before, I ordered a fruit salad while everyone else ordered pancakes, bacon, eggs, and biscuits. My food was more beautiful and better than anything else at the table. A whole pineapple hollowed out and filled with fresh fruit and whipped cream, just for me. The other boys smeared margarine on their cold fried things. Mike, jealous, sent his eggs back and ordered what I did, anything for the birthday boy. I'd forgotten that it was a drag brunch. A snarky queen flitted around during the service, occasionally lip-syncing to a song or two and making jokes on the microphone. She did this thing in between numbers where she'd go backstage into the kitchen and then come out rubbing her nose theatrically like she just snorted coke. I thought that was hilarious. Maybe not pretending, actually. We all drank bottomless mimosas. Brian, the other person I knew, convinced the table that we should switch to screwdrivers since both drinks had orange juice in them. Always a troublemaker, his nickname was Bri Bri. After the brunch service, Bri Bri convinced us to go to another bar, so we went to Barracuda or Pieces or another place I had never been. But in the middle of the day, it was empty. We watched a sad, lonely queen do a ballad, but then the boys and I took over the stage and just sat there drinking and laughing. There was no one there, and Brian got us shots, the ones that come in big plastic test tubes. I had been hungover that morning, but then had swung too far forward and was fantastically drunk again. I started flirting with Mike and he started flirting back, which felt magical, karmic. I knew it was probably just the alcohol and my cool striped leather jacket. It makes me look like a superhero. In the years we had known each other, Mike had never before responded to my advances. I couldn't let this opportunity slip away. When we left the second bar, it was dark outside. We had been in there drinking for hours. We decided to go back to Brooklyn. At this point, even before we got into the taxi, Mike and I were making out, sloppy and wet. The hundreds of dollars I'd spent on the jacket were paying off, drawing him into me. We had to take 2 cabs to Brooklyn. I sat in the back seat with Bri Bri to my left and Mike to my right. It got blurry over the bridge. Somehow the other cab with Jordan and the guys I didn't know made it over to Bri Bri's house before we did, and his roommate let them in. We went to Bri Bri's house where we had a nightcap and some cocaine as well. Bri Bri kept a little porcelain container of it in a kitchen drawer, like any other spice. His house was legendary. Unlike all the other buildings on his block in Williamsburg, his had yet to be renovated. It was a split level 3 bedroom from a century ago, surrounded by luxury skyscrapers. Every year he threw a big Easter party. Lots of dyed eggs and candy and little bowls of cigarettes for the guests. His house was full of antiques, decorated in a kitschy retro Southern style. We would point to plates of cupcakes, cookies, finger sandwiches, and say, "Easter, eat her." I never tired of that joke. He made a bonfire in the backyard where he had a garden and a swing set, and the neighbors in the luxury buildings always called the fire department, who were all surprised to find what looked like a 1960s acid freakout. I never turned down an invitation to go to Bri Bri's house, no matter the holiday, not even on Mike's birthday when we were already wasted. Mike and I had hatched a plan to leave together, so we had a farewell toast and a couple of goodnight bumps before we peeled off. Bye-bye, Bri Bri. Mike lived around the corner from me, itself a huge turn on. On our way home, he said, "You're gonna fuck me, right?" I said, "Yeah." "And you're gonna breed me, right? I'm on prep, don't worry." "Of course," I said, "it's your birthday." Being coy like I was obliging him. He was a fancy fashion editor, but had a tiny, filthy apartment, I guess to save money. When we undressed, he was surprised that I was so direct in bed. I guess my enthusiasm hadn't registered. We stopped after a minute, though, because he had to go to the bathroom. He hollered from the toilet that he was sorry, but he couldn't continue. that cocaine always gave him indigestion and I should just go home. "Oh, okay," I said. "I can come back another time if you want." I'm so pathetic. The next morning, there was a group text. I only recognized half the numbers. Someone said, "That was such a fun brunch." Another person said that they definitely blacked out. Someone else said that they wished they were in the car, the other taxi, the one with the blowjob. I said, "I wish I was in the car with a blowjob too." A number I didn't recognize said that I was the one who had gotten a blowjob in the back of a car. I forgot, but then it started to become clear to me as it was explained. While we were in the cab on the way to Brian's house, I was making out with Mike, and Bri started rubbing my pants and unzipped my fly and gave me a little fellatio. I didn't come or anything. He didn't do it long enough for to get the attention of the driver, but I think he was just trying to join in the incipient romance between Mike and I. Maybe he was trying to disrupt it, spread it around, pop it like a balloon. I wondered, is it a blackout really if it's so extended? Isn't it more like a blurring, like the blue hour? Growing up in California during drought seasons, when there were electricity shortages, the state organized rolling blackouts to prevent brownouts, which could be dangerous and start fires. That's what it felt like. Worse somehow than a total erasure of my memory, but instead a corruption, a dimming. I remembered that before he moved to New York, Mike wrote something shitty about me online, that I was a loser and had no friends, piling on after a particularly cruel article about me came out. When Mike moved here, we met for drinks, and he sort of flirted with me, but made it clear that he wasn't going to go beyond resting his hand on my thigh. When I asked about the nasty thing he'd written about me, he vaguely admitted to it, but brushed it off, saying, "That was before." I thought he meant that it was before he met me, but maybe he meant that it was before he moved here. I think he hoped I would have forgotten about it. Since then, I've wondered if this was my low point, trying to turn a foe into a friend. Yes, I had a crush on Mike, of course I did. I admired his casual cruelty. I thought I could convince him to like me by being nice enough, by showing up enough. I was trying to be durable, calm, useful, and pleasant. I wanted to prove my worthiness by what exactly? Being forgiving, being patient, being willing to make myself vulnerable, to admit that I was attracted to him. I realized that all the guys at his birthday party had a crush on Mike too. That's why we were invited, but only I was corny and foolish enough to admit it. I felt chosen. He called me Maxie. No one calls me that, it's not my nickname. I didn't want to disabuse him of it, I just wanted to be a pet. I wanted to be loyal, like a dog. As a kid, I was in a production of Romeo and Juliet, and I wanted very much to be Tybalt, the prophetic villain whose passion leads to a spectacular climax. Instead, I was cast as Benvolio, the best friend who doesn't get to do anything except whine. "This character," the director said, "he's like a puppy. He's so loyal." I went to Shakespeare camp for several years. We were precocious children who memorized the full text entirely phonetically. We rattled off monologues completely unaware of what we were saying, but felt sophisticated and advanced. I remember the directors, mostly middle-aged and out-of-work actors and speech coaches, looking miserable and bored, chain-smoking and pacing. Occasionally, some of them lost patience with us, got fed up with babysitting, threw tantrums, and stormed out of rehearsals. It must have been unbearable for them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Max. We're going to take a quick break while we set up for the next set. And just as a reminder, the $5 admission fee does also apply to those who are joining us at home. So the details for how to make that donation are going to come up on your screen. All right, and we'll see you in a minute.
Okay, sit down, read.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Okay, everybody, if we can all get settled, we're gonna come back with Edmund White. Yes. Welcome back. Okay. I befriended Edmund White as a youth after emailing him with the audacious request that he perform at a birthday party that I was throwing myself. Not only that, it was in Brooklyn. I was a brazen scamp. Mr. White graciously acquiesced, despite my jejune affections being entirely intellectual, and gamely journeyed all the way to my outer borough to be fawned over by a basement full of baby-lit queers. Years later, we were appearing together at a literary event when he was approached by a slim man from the audience in his late 30s who shakily professed his love for Edmund's corpus. He told Edmund that his books were profoundly meaningful to him through the years and thanked the author profusely for existing and giving voice to queer states of desire. Edmund nodded and thanked the interloper for his praise, asking, "So, are you a writer?" The man shook his head. "No, I'm a neurosurgeon." When the fan left smiling, Edmund turned to me and declared, "See, I'm not dishwater." The standard issue writerly insecurity that plagues even the most established creatives belies the laundry list of laurels and accolades Mr. White has received, including citations and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, Lambda Literary Publishing Triangle, French Order of Arts and Letters, National Book Critics Circle, American Academy of Arts and Letters, as well as being named the New York State author, and most recently, receiving Lifetime Achievement Awards from the National Book Foundation and PEN America. Born in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1940, White got his start writing for magazines such as Time, Life, Newsweek, and Saturday Review. His earliest novels, Forgetting Elena, Nocturne for the King of Naples, and Caracole, are deliciously experimental, exploring opulent underworlds inhabited by coded coteries with lusciously impenetrable Jamesian psychologies. He is best known for a series of semi-autobiographical novels, A Boy's Own Story, The Beautiful Room is Empty, The Farewell Symphony, and The Married Man, which chronicle mid-century gay life from a furtive childhood complicated by a fierce sex drive and an overbearing shrink, through phases of sexual liberation, obsession, and endless gratification, to navigating the deadly AIDS crisis here and abroad as friends and lovers dropped left and right. He's published at least 5 memoirs covering his storied experiences in famous milieus, with books about his time living in Paris, Our Paris, Inside a Pearl, and New York City, City Boy. There are periods of his life that have been analyzed repeatedly in the form of short stories, novels, essays, memoirs, and several biographies, one of which I just learned is, there's a new one in the works. His real life and fantasies always cross-pollinate. The author makes sense of reality through fiction and vice versa, and his forthcoming novel is an excellent example of that, but I'll get to it. Edmund literally wrote the book on gay sex. I have it right here. Oh, sorry, my computer went to sleep that I was reading this off of. Okay. I've personally never succumbed to his tutelage, instead trying to greedily nestle into what he calls the prestige of his friendship. but White always seemed insatiably horny and readily available for romantic and sexual dalliances outside of his primary relationship with his spouse, the novelist Michael Carroll, surely numbering his partners in the thousands, a typical figure for any respectable gay man. As a reader, I've detected a cavernous masochism undergirding his intense fixations on young, dominant inamoratos. In his memoir, My Lives, he dedicates a chapter to My Master, a kid half his age with whom he becomes hopelessly captivated in his mid-60s. His possessive young lover degraded and disciplined him. Quote, I was content to worship at this living shrine, to probe his tender, lordly balls with my tongue, to plunge the full weight of his cock down the scabbard of my throat. You're the one who asked to sit there, Ed. And to dare to crawl up beside him and lick out the sour taste from under his powerful arms, end quote. They role-played skewed power differentials and fantasized about the young man pissing on Edmund's grave after he died. But of course, the boy broke his heart. White's friends and colleagues were embarrassed and horrified at the obscene depravity of Edmund's grief. All this over some trick? I'm not sure the author would see it this way, as his response to heartbreak is effrontery. But from my readerly perspective, I wonder if the humiliation and the loss is, part of it. You surrender to somebody completely, you are used up, you are discarded, then you must cleanse yourself in your own delicious sense of betrayal, and finally, turn it into art. This pattern repeats in White's latest novel, A Previous Life, which opens in the year 2050 and concerns a similar relationship between a long dead and nearly forgotten author, coincidentally named Edmund White, and another admirer half his age, this time a conceited Sicilian bisexual harpsichordist named Ruggiero. In the distant future, he is now married to a much younger woman named Constance. Following a skiing accident, the previously unforthcoming couple decide to confess their prolific sexual histories to each other in the form of private remembrances that they read aloud in front of a roaring fire. Like Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas once did, they catalog their previous lovers and measure them against each other, supposedly to strengthen their bond, although they abruptly separate before they're finished telling their stories. This exercise didn't end well for Stein either, actually. Both characters have fascinating pasts explicated in crisp, alacritous prose, and the chronicle of their pseudo-aristocratic follies comfortably reminded me of Howard Sturgis' delicate novel Bell Chamber. White wrote the introduction for the latest edition. But this is the real Edmund White, writing from the perspective of a fictionalized character who betrayed a fictionalized Edmund White. So expect a certain level of postmodern instability and an undertone of bitchy candor, despite a blessed lack of score settling, as a spurned ex-lover inhabits the psychology of his lost object of desire. White plumbs the depths of this conceited and constant musician, reveling in his pain while leveraging it for art's sake. This is a story about the vicissitudes of age and its emotional fallout on romantic relationships. Edmund describes himself with a spitefulness none other would dare or even conceive, so that a supposedly gross tally of particular deficits becomes strangely erotic. Quote, the rolls of fat, the tiny functionless penis, the sagging breasts and the giant nipples with a history, the bizarre odor of skin fungus, his lack of basic hygiene, the rotting teeth and horrible breath, his leaking bladder leaving dark droplets on the pale carpet, end quote. Through the eyes of others, White imagines himself as a skulking blob of paradoxically narcissistic self-effacement. And yet, through some caricatured exaggerations, the luminosity of White's affection remains deeply haunting. Those around him may not understand its intensity, but are still lit by its glow. In this story, nobody is wholly redeemed or destroyed, only subjected to the intricate attentions and readings of each other, each who must parse and quantify the value of their relationships according to their own dispositions. White is perhaps the least American of our country's most important writers, considering the lifetimes he spent elsewhere in Rome or Paris, so that his perspectives, sophistications, manners, and tastes are so Europeanized as to seem unfamiliar to American provincials such as myself. The character of Edmund White in A Previous Life felt similarly opaque and slippery, intentionally so, ambiguous enough in his motivations to titillate and slightly unnerve. As Edmund White once admonished me, let some of the mystery remain. His recent novel, A Saint from Texas, concerns twin sisters born of humble beginnings who followed their callings into the larger world, one woman marrying into Parisian high society, while the other sacrifices herself to an all-consuming love of God, becoming a nun and the titular saint. I see Edmund as both of those sisters, sewn into one, the cultured doyen of European aristocracy and the severe, flagellant disciple bleeding on the rack of his artistic vocation. It's a unique combo, which the author suggests might contribute to some future diminishment of his legacy. Although more objectively, I suspect his finicky contradictions and drive for submission are just as important and likely to contribute to his ongoing canonization as our own gay saint, as his Proustian lyricism and analysis of gay culture and identity. We are truly in the presence of greatness tonight, and extraordinarily lucky to welcome to the stage Edmund White.
Thank you. Hard to follow that introduction. Thank you. And I guess that's the kind of, this book is not coming out until January. So this is the first time I've read from it. One of the main characters is a Sicilian nobleman who plays the harpsichord, who's called Ruggiero, and he goes back and forth from having affairs with women and marriages with women to affairs with boys. Soon I met Cesare and lived with him for 4 years until he had a vision and became a priest. He was a student at Santa Cecilia like me, and he was so tall and blonde that everyone was aware of him. Like me, he was Sicilian, which always led to comments. Sicilian, so blonde, so tall. What was not said but understood, so handsome. I suppose he was the most dramatic beauty in our school. He was always joking and roughhousing. To me, he seemed to be just a big kid, but an endearing one. You could tell he wanted everyone to like him. I found out that he was a bass and had a beautiful voice. There was a scarcity of basses at Santa Cecilia, which is their music school in Rome. Plenty of tenors and baritones, but only one other genuine bass, and that added to his popularity. His speaking voice was also deep, a voice from the balls, which only made everyone picture his balls, big and pink and wrapped in fine gold hairs, or so we imagine. When he sang, he made us think of the Grand Inquisitor in Verdi's Don Carlo, making the chandelier lustres tremble. I think he had found out that I was Sicilian too, which showed he was curious enough about me to ask around about me. He always smiled at me whenever he saw me, which I found flattering. Everybody was aware of his friendliness since he stood out, literally, head and shoulders above everyone else, his great blonde head pivoting above a smaller, darker crowd in the hallways leading into a classroom or a practice hall. Once he bumped into me, looked around, registered who I was, smiled that whole snowbank of a smile, and said in Sicilian, mi piacere, please, which doesn't make much sense in any language. I took it as a mild invitation. Then the woman for whom I was writing the ballet invited me and Cesare and 3 other friends to a group dinner and a concert. I was seated next to Cesare. Whose idea was that? He'd bought the ice cream, saying he couldn't cook. I bought the pasta course, pasta alla norma, fried eggplant, which we warmed up in a big skillet. Someone else brought bread, and a girl made polpettoni, meatballs. The choreographer, Barbara, provided the place settings, the water, the wine, and a big salad. I asked Cesare where he was from in Sicily. Several times he touched my shoulder, and once even my face with the back of his huge warm hand. It shocked me, that liberty he was taking, and I think it confused the other students. He was strangely daring and shy. Perhaps his great height and beauty made him both aggressive and self-conscious. Maybe he was drunk. I remember once he was irritated that the man at the next table in the sidewalk cafe was smoking. Chasery was always protecting his voice. And the man pointed out testily that they were outside and smoking was perfectly legal. Chasery said nothing, but simply stood up to his full 6'4" and the man stubbed out his cigarette immediately. I don't think Chasery ever struck anyone, but strangers were frightened of him. Yet he was equally ashamed of his height and often slumped, walking or sitting, a useless precaution since he always stood out wherever he went. He would still draw notice, even in the midst of a Norwegian high school basketball team. The whole dinner was festive. Italians are party animals, though they behave and drink sensibly. After we all washed up and sat up, you never see a drunk Italian. After we all washed up and set up the chairs and the audience was seated, I played my new ballet score while Barbara occasionally narrated the action, which irritated me as though my score were incomplete. Did Stravinsky have to narrate his scenes of pagan life in Russia as he played the first piano version of The Rite of Spring? Then several others sang in groups. I sang countertenor in one ensemble, and somewhere Chasery sang with his warm, lustrous bass. Walking beside me on the way home, Chasery said, "Oh, I can see you're a real musician. Maybe you could help me. All I have is my voice." "And your presence," I added. "Well, yes, thanks, but I can't really read music, and I can't accompany myself on the piano. I have to be taught every score by rote." "As Pavarotti did," I said encouragingly. "Yes, but his father had a beautiful voice as well, and he grew up in a family of singers. He sang from an early age. I didn't start until I was 18. My German and English pronunciation is good, my Russian non-existent, and my French lamentable." Suddenly I found him so attractive with his big blue eyes, rosy skin, white blonde mop. He was so obviously impressed by my musicianship that I was no longer intimidated by his towering height. I realized he would always submit to me, to my advice, my superior knowledge, even my princely social status. That may sound odd to an American, since in America, everyone assumes he or she is middle class, everyone from Homer Simpson to John Rockefeller. I liked the idea of this blonde beast who was 8 years older than me, submitting to me. I found the idea of two men, one active and the other passive, among the most powerful, most beautiful pairings in existence, even more profound, forgive me, than the man-woman couple. Why, you ask? He's reading all this to his wife. Why, you ask? Precisely because it's not biological. You know, I agree with Baudelaire that an artificial woman's face, starved, made up, is more beautiful than that of a tan, big-toothed, athletic California gal. More beautiful precisely because it's artificial, willed into being, original, less healthy, more achieved through ingenuity. Give me a pallid chartreuse-colored Vogue model any day over a broad-shouldered, square-jawed Olympic female athletes whose chromosomes are routinely tested. Two men, top and bottom, must invent themselves. They weren't brought up to play these roles. They're winging it at every moment. That's the beauty in it, the art, as in the art of the onagata in kabuki. Constance thought, he has such a vile idea of women. That's her thoughts. He has such a vile idea of women, but I'm sure that's not his real opinion. He can be a poseur. And I remember that he was so taken by Baudelaire's essay on cosmetics. But he likes tan, healthy women. He likes beautiful women who are fat. What a poseur. But I wish he wouldn't say things like that. And at his age, He should be sincere. He's 70 and she's 30. And all that about tops and bottoms. Of course, people are a collection of opinions, often things said by lovers they overheard and borrowed at all different times of their life, like travel stickers. For many voyages over the years, some almost effaced, some recent on an old steamer trunk. Unless challenged, they don't try to reconcile all these contradictory opinions they picked up during a long life. But he has a doctorate in philosophy and should try to be more consistent. Ruggiero read, of course, I had no reason to think Cesare was interested in men. In fact, I'd heard he had several girlfriends, that he was a professional heartbreaker, but I could see the submission in his eyes, as a young mahout can see devotion in the eyes of what will someday be his elephant. I invited him to practice with me. He said he'd come the next day at 4. When he came, he sat beside me on the piano bench. Within seconds, we were embracing. To paraphrase what Dante wrote of Paolo and Francesca, they practiced no more that day. I was astonished by his huge dick, though generally, even in the locker room, I was indifferent to dicks. But in this case, it was the biggest one I'd ever seen, and I hoped he wouldn't think it gave him fucking rights. I wanted to do all the fucking. That was my birthright, I believed. Over the years, I learned most gay men, as my aunt would say, want to be the wife. But some, especially one with such a huge dick, would assume every man would fall down and worship it, not me. Of course, at that time, we were both inexperienced and didn't know the ways of the sexual world. We were happy kissing and licking and indulging in mutual masturbation. He would lie side by side, we would lie side by side and jerk each other off while kissing. His body was so big, it was like hiking up the mountains. Buttocks, each as big as a Christmas ham, shoulders pink with health like glaciers in the evening glow, a wet mouth and a huge muscular tongue like a giant snail's foot. He couldn't resist sucking me once he'd glided down to my waist, kissing me all the way. He held my erect penis fastidiously in one vast hand. He was my Polyphemus, and I his rival, Asis. And in my head, I started singing, "Ruddier is the berry, sweeter is the cherry." That's something by Handel. If Polyphemus had but one eye, I discovered it as the piss hole of his massive dick. He frowned at my penis in his hand and evaluating, then unresisting, he began to lick it. The urge was too strong, the experiment too exciting. I knew my body, disappointingly to some people, had absolutely no odor, so he couldn't be put off by that. He licked me experimentally, as if he'd find out in a moment whether I tasted good or bad. Unleashed, he set about his job in earnest. I had the feeling he'd never done this before and that he'd fantasized about doing it during hours and hours of savage masturbation. He looked me in the eye for a moment as if to verify I wasn't shocked by his zeal. I nodded encouragingly and he turned wild, as if all his fantasies, now that they were permitted, had become cannibalistic. When I ejaculated all over his face, he looked offended for a moment and dragged his hand disapprovingly through the gobs of spunk on his cheek, his hair, across his mouth, even in his eye. I jumped up and fetched a washcloth and swabbed his eye, but left the rest of the cum on his face. Like a cat tiptoeing into a puddle of milk, he raised his paw to his mouth, then started rubbing and licking his face clean. He must have liked the taste, or at least the abjection. I wasn't in the mood to jerk him off and thought anyway I'd be doing him a favor by leaving him horny, desiring. Inexperienced Catholic boys like us feel guilty after they come. I was saving him from that regret and keeping him frustrated and focused on me and my superb body. I would never move him in. I'd made that mistake already. His previous girlfriend drove him crazy. Chasery, beautiful as he was, endearing as his voice might be, was deeply insecure about his lack of musical training. I knew he'd cornered several piano students to accompany him in songs he was learning, since he couldn't read music, and as I was to learn later, he had no sense of pitch. His voice was a beautiful instrument he didn't know how to play. I found him dazzling because he was a star, a beauty, intelligent, wounded, complicated, and submissive to me, but not by nature. Several times as we would walk down Vittorio Emanuele and cross the bridge toward the Vatican in my apartment, we noticed that a spectrally thin girl was following us. It's his previous girlfriend. It was Lucia. She would dart in doorways if we looked her way. I even hailed her once with a big smile, uh, but she'd vanished like the firebird. Sometimes late at night, after I was already asleep in my Lilliputian pull-out bed with my Gulliver huge chasery by my side, the phone would ring. When I would pick up, no one replied, but I could hear breathing and once a high-pitched whimper. In the corridors at school, she'd often be tailing us. In the cafeteria, she'd sit alone near us, but never look up, pretending to be deep in a score. The choreographer of my ballet told me that Lucia knew in her whole body that I wasn't gay, that I was just posing as a sodomite to baffle her, to be cruel, to make it clear to her we'd never reconcile, demonstrating I'd found my true self in the gigantic arms of another man. Lucia was pious and determined to save me from burning in hell for eternity. My friend said, I've known tons of anorexic dancers, but Lucia is in the danger zone. Someone should notify her parents. She should be hospitalized and put on a feeding tube. My first instinct was to reach out and soothe Lucia, but all I had to do was recall how she'd suffocated me with her obsessive attentions, and I would forego my altruistic urges. I didn't want her back. Later, she was confined for a year to a mental hospital. I tutored Chasery for hours and hours, and though I was patient with him, almost as if I were dealing with a child, a beginner, he would become more and more resentful. That is, he always followed my advice to the best of his means and would thank me profusely. And since he knew he had a long way to go to catch up, especially since the school reduced the number of students each year, the graduating class was only half the size of the entering one, but he had the usual resentment of gratitude against the benefactor. That he couldn't read music was a grave problem, but one that could be repaired if he took piano lessons, say, every day during the summer break. But his real problem was a faulty sense of pitch. If he had to skip down over an octave, for instance, from a middle C to a low B flat, he could never find the lower note, no matter how many times I traced the interval on the piano. He would land on the A or whatever, but never the right note. If he had to sing a long phrase of half note intervals with lots of flats and sharps, I would break it down into 3 or 4 note segments and make him work on each unit until we returned to the whole phrase. But I'd be left pounding on the mistaken note. He'd always flub the longer phrase, even if the segments were good. And I'd correct his pronunciation, even in Tuscan, which he spoke with a slight Sicilian accent, a double B, 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 instead of the single Italian B, something one would never notice in conversation or would think charming, as when you, Constance, say siempre in Spanish instead of the Italian sempre. After our long rehearsals, he'd thank me humbly, but then we'd have sex. But then when we have sex, he was an extremely aggressive bottom. His kisses were those of a vampire, and more than once he actually drew blood. My nipples are little hard brown things without sensitivity, as you know, but he'd maul me on one side or the other like a puppy rooting for a teat. The worst was when he started angling that huge cock toward my mouth, battering my closed lips. Unlike mine, his cock smelled, which can be thrilling if you've taken the right drugs. But as a daily après repetition meal, it was repulsive. We actually wrestled, but in the end, I won. I'd fuck him and he'd wince all through it. I never let him have a release. I wanted to keep him permanently horny. Once during a concert at school, he sang with a quartet. My grandfather had come up to Rome and I invited him since my ballet was also on the program. Cesare was chosen because he's the only bass available, but it was a disaster. He sang the opening note a third too high. He continued off tune, though the other three singers sang on pitch. My grandfather, who knew we were friends, whispered to me, "He's stornato," discordant. When we were alone at my place, Cesare was smiling and said, "I was pretty good, wasn't I?" I said he'd been good in the rehearsals, but not so good during the performance. I'd taped it. I still have the tape somewhere. And I played it for him and he could tell what a disaster it had been. The other students avoided him for a few days. Our sex life became even more violent, then non-existent. He didn't want me to touch him. Cesare used to teach me for piously composing motets to the Virgin for our family church in Castel Nuovo, just as he liked to pretend I was a snobbish aristocrat and he was a man of the people. What gave him ammunition was that I loved sacred music and did compose for our church, and the choir is still singing one or two of my adolescent compositions. And once when he said he'd like to learn to be as diplomatic as I am, I replied, "I'm afraid it takes 6 centuries of breeding." In truth, I was an atheist who despised the Vatican and a Republican who took seriously only an elite of talent and intelligence. Then Cesare's own family, who'd been typical smug Italian non-believers and heard mass only during weddings and funerals, and the men smoked outside while their wives were kneeling in the cathedral for Christmas and Easter. His own family were suddenly awakened by a charismatic priest. The whole family became fervent Christians and insisted Cesare come to mass with them while he was in Sicily for the weekend. One evening, he was watching a gangster movie when suddenly Christ's face appeared on the screen. No one else, it seemed, could see him, and asked him to give up his life of sin and to serve the Lord. This was immediately after his fiasco as a singer at the school concert. The next day, back in Rome after the holiday, he told me he was dropping out of Santa Cecilia and entering a monastery school in Sicily with the intention of becoming a priest. I said, "But you've never shown the least interest in religion." And he told me about his vision of Christ. I just held the back of my hand to his forehead as if he were feverish and delirious. He'd always liked to sit on my knee, though it was awkward given his size. When something upset him, I'd put him on my knee, my foot well braced, and kiss him and comfort him. Now I started to pull him down, but he stiffened. "We can no longer do that. I promised Christ I would give up the sins of the flesh." I said, "Oh, don't be so silly, darling. There is no Christ. He doesn't exist. Just because you poison yourself with a bad kernel of sugared popcorn while watching James Cagney." He said he was leaving Rome that night and heading back to Sicily and to the priest who had converted him. "Where does that leave us?" I asked. "I'm not sure." Then he thought, "We can be lovers in Christ." "Oh yeah? How will that work exactly?" "I still love you. We'll be together forever in heaven, but no sex here on earth, and you'll be a priest. We'll love each other in Christ." "I think that's creepy," I said. "I've made up my mind." "Me too. I don't want any part of it," I said. He was gone the same evening on a late train toward Sicily. He embraced me at the door. I had no gay friends, and I certainly couldn't discuss it with my grandfather. I felt injured physically, as if a vital organ had been removed from my body. It was better to be angry at Cesare's foolishness, at the church's profiting from mental illness, than to be hurt, which wasn't my style. We'd been together 4 years, the most difficult of my diploma, and composition. Maybe I'd neglected Cesare, but I don't think so. My shrink says I'm always trying to please everyone. I'd been harsh or just honest about the fiasco of his concert, but his lack of musicianship, despite the remarkable luster of his voice, would keep him from having a career, even as a high school music teacher. I went up for a long walk on the Via della Conciliazione to St. Peter's. It was raining slightly, and no one was about except three short, dark-skinned nuns. I imagine this was the first thing they wanted to see in Rome after their 20-hour flight from Jakarta. The way Bernini's arcade opened up after its narrow entrance and embraced me in its marble arms, supporting colossal statues of bishops and saints, thrilled me with its theatricality as it framed the facade of St. Peter's. I felt there was no place in the whole world less spiritual, more an emblem of wealth and worldly power than St. Peter's. But in the rain, without the crowds, with the gentle winter mist floating among the columns, the place did seem poetic, if the poetry was epic, not lyrical, secular, not devotional. I thought bitterly how my joking giant of a lover with the big dick and the failed music career had been stolen from me by this hoax, the Catholic Church, which seemed legitimate only because it was so old and rich and counted millions of adherents, all of them duped by the incense and the glittering, over-polished white marble. Heart of stone, the church, I said to myself. Then another part of me, an earlier part, realized I had once fervently believed, I was once a familiar of the Holy Ghost, the Spirito Santo, and that at least for the 2 years of puberty, I'd prayed at bedtime, fearful I'd die in my sleep before becoming famous. I wept at the feet of the statue of the Virgin in our family chapel and feverishly composed my sacred cantatas with verses from the Bible, Old and New Testaments. If I was honest with myself, that old me was slightly jealous of Cesare's conversion, his mystical glimpse of Christ's bleeding head on the screen. It was ridiculous, but then so was everything but incontestable positivism, numbers, measurement, verification. That was something solid, not ridiculous, but everything that gave us a reason for living. Love, poetry, Bach. None of that could be justified or even explained. I felt that Cesare had fallen victim to the marauder church on the heels of his singing fiasco, that there was nothing naturally religious in his makeup, that soon he'd be one more petty wrist-slapping basketball coaching village curate, that he might lead the local choir ineptly, that he might even pinch an underage boy's rosy bottom. The next time I was in Sicily, Cesare begged me to see Father Ernesto. I agreed reluctantly. He lived only 2 villages over in Castelforto. I drove over in my little red Cinquecento, found the church easily enough. I was just in time for our appointment. Ernesto's office was backstage behind the altar. The dusty corridor was lined with banners used in the yearly Santa Febronia festival and a box of hosts and what I guess was a jug of sour holy wine. Come in, my son, the white-skinned, blue-knuckled man in robes said. He was someone in his 50s, I imagine. The surplice revealed he was at once skinny and possessed of a little belly. I was already irked that such a plain man would have designs on my beautiful giant. I'm not your son, I'm a stranger, I said. He smiled a little ironic tilde of a smile. Welcome, stranger. He stood and beckoned toward a leather armchair that was losing its stuffing. I sat on the wide, welcoming arm. I didn't want to get hay or whatever it was on my trousers. So he said with a Milanese accent, let's talk about your friend. I'll leave right now, I said, if you continue to call him my friend. He was my lover, and it wasn't just one night. We were together 4 years and we made love hundreds of times. We were both very randy, and he took to it very naturally. Ernesto raised a skeptical eyebrow. God loves the sinner, but hates the sin. Then I said, he must have hated our sin thousands of times because Cesare loves sucking my cock and getting fucked by it. People change, Ernesto said quietly. You've heard of the prodigal son? Don't condescend to me, I said. We both sat in silence. Finally, the priest asked, why did you agree to come? I consider you a criminal, I said, because you haven't sent him to a psychiatrist. It's obvious that Cesare has had a psychotic break and you've just taken unscrupulous advantage of a poor sick boy. He keeps hearing voices while he's praying, a voice who's sending messages to me. I told him he should ask the Holy Ghost to communicate with me directly. I see it very differently. Ernesto started to clean the lenses of his glasses with the dirty gray handkerchief, working with the diligence that was designed to upstage our dispute. For me, it's a matter of redemption. The Holy Ghost has intervened. I said, but Cesare didn't see the ghost, but Christ on the movie screen. Oh, so you admit it was our Lord at least? I don't believe one bit of your superstitious nonsense, I said. He actually stroked his chin. Oddly, Cesare told me that when you two met, you were the pious one. I wrote church music, I said, that's all. He made fun of me for being a holy water frog, a beguina, a bigot. But I wasn't. I just liked the music, that's all. And for a kid in a village much like this one, there weren't that many opportunities for hearing your own music. Too bad you didn't acknowledge the divine inspiration of your gift, the priest said. Too bad, I said, that you can't see you're a vicious con man recruiting crazed boys for your empty pulpits. He stood and made the sign of the cross over me. I turned on my heel.